A well-wisher at a flower show told King Charles he was looking good for his age. It was the kind of harmless, friendly compliment monarchs hear constantly on walkabouts, the sort of line that usually gets a polite smile and a quick thank you in return. Instead, Charles paused and gave an answer that was drier, more honest, and a lot more revealing than anyone standing there probably expected. The exchange happened on July 22 at the Royal Horticultural Society's Sandringham Flower Show, an event that, by coincidence, landed on the same day as his grandson Prince George's 13th birthday. The 77-year-old king was making his way through the crowd during a public walkabout when a member of the public, roughly his own age, told him, "I'm the same age as you. You are looking good." It's exactly the kind of comment royals field dozens of times a day at these events: warm, well-meaning, low stakes. Charles's response wasn't, "It gets much harder, doesn't it?" he replied. "For words, but there's a lot sitting underneath them. Not thank you." Not a deflection, not a formal non-answer of the kind royals are often trained to give. Just a blunt, dry acknowledgement that yes, it does in fact get harder, delivered with the kind of self-deprecating honesty you'd expect from a friend at a pub, not a reigning monarch on official duty. It's a small moment, and it might have passed by unnoticed if it weren't part of a much longer, increasingly consistent pattern. Because this isn't the first time Charles has responded to compliments or questions about his age with exactly this kind of dry, matter-of-fact honesty. Back in September 2025, during a visit to Midland Metropolitan University Hospital, he made a strikingly similar comment. "This is the terrible thing, as I am discovering already," he said at the time. "The bits don't work so well when you get past 70. That's not a throwaway pleasantry either. It's a specific, physical admission, delivered in a hospital setting of all places, about his own body simply not functioning the way it used to. The pattern goes back further still. In February 2025, Charles admitted that his skiing days were now behind him, a small but pointed acknowledgement for a man who was once known for his enthusiasm on the slopes, marking one more physical activity quietly move into the past tense. And in October 2024, when asked what his favorite sport was, he gave an answer that was almost startlingly plain for a public figure typically surrounded by careful messaging: "I can't do much now, too many injuries." Stack those comments next to each other: skiing behind him, sport limited by injuries, the bits not working the way they used to, and now, it gets much harder. And what emerges isn't a one-off joke. It's a running, fairly consistent thread of a man being unusually candid, in public, about what getting older actually feels like from the inside. To understand why that consistency matters, you have to look at what's actually been happening behind those comments for the past 2.5 years. Charles first announced he'd been diagnosed with cancer in early 2024, a disclosure that, at the time, marked one of the most direct, personal health announcements a reigning British monarch has ever made. Royal health has traditionally been handled with a level of formality and distance that keeps the public informed just enough and no further. Charles's cancer diagnosis broke from that pattern almost immediately, framed from the start in more personal, human terms than palace communications typically use. The most recent official update on his condition came in December 2025, and it was framed, in the king's own words, as good news. He said that thanks to early diagnosis, effective intervention, and what he called adherence to doctors' orders, his own schedule of cancer treatment could be reduced going into the new year. He went further than simply reporting his own progress, to connecting it to something larger. This milestone is both a personal blessing and a testimony to the remarkable advances that have been made in cancer care in recent years, he said, adding that he hoped it might offer encouragement to the roughly 50% of people who will be diagnosed with the illness at some point in their own lives. It's a notably outward-facing way to describe your own health update, using a personal milestone as a moment to reassure an entire country full of people quietly facing the same diagnosis. Buckingham Palace's own language around the update was, characteristically, more measured. The palace said Charles had responded exceptionally well to treatment, and that his doctors had advised his ongoing care would now move into what was described as a precautionary phase, one that would be continuously monitored and reviewed to protect and prioritize his continued recovery. That kind of careful, clinical phrasing is standard for royal health communications, and it sits in an interesting contrast with the king's own instinct, again and again, to answer real people's real comments with blunt, plain-spoken honesty instead. That contrast, measured palace statements on one side, dry personal honesty on the other, is really the whole story here. It's not that Charles is hiding anything or that the palace is being evasive. It's that two very different communication styles are operating side by side, the institutional one, careful and clinical, built for official record-keeping, and the personal one, which shows up specifically in these small, unscripted moments at public events, where Charles seems to consistently choose humor and directness over performance. There's a family dimension to this story too, and it adds another layer of quiet reassurance. Earlier this month, Prince Harry paid a visit to his father, notable in itself, given the well-documented distance between Harry and much of the rest of the royal family in recent years. Afterward, speaking to guests at the Time 100 Sports Gala in New York City, Harry offered a brief, informal update of his own, telling the room that his father was doing great. It's a small comment, filtered through a son who has his own complicated relationship with royal life and with public statements about his family, but it lines up with everything else emerging from Charles's own public behavior, a picture of steady, ongoing recovery, delivered in casual, human terms rather than a formal bulletin. Interestingly, the flower show produced a second moment worth noting, one with a very different emotional register but a similar underlying theme. During that same walkabout, another well-wisher told Charles, "You look so much like your mum," a reference to his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II. According to reporting on the exchange, Charles appeared to take the comment warmly, stopping to chat briefly rather than moving quickly past it. It's a small detail, but it's worth sitting with for a moment. In the space of one public walkabout, Charles fielded two comments touching on two of the more sensitive threads running through his life right now, his own aging body, and the memory of the mother whose 70-year reign he eventually inherited, and responded to both with the same unhurried, unguarded ease. No visible discomfort. No quick deflection. Just a king, in a garden, taking both comments as they came. What makes all of this worth paying attention to isn't any single quote in isolation. It's the pattern building up across nearly 2 years of small, mostly unplanned public moments, hospital visits, walkabouts, casual questions from strangers, where Charles has consistently chosen the same register, plain, a little self-deprecating, honest about physical limits without turning it into a bigger production than it needs to be. That's a specific choice, even if it doesn't look like one in the moment. A public figure managing a serious diagnosis has plenty of ways to handle questions about his health and his aging body. He could deflect entirely, offer only formal statements through the palace, or simply avoid the subject whenever it comes up casually. Instead, Charles has repeatedly leaned toward humor and bluntness, delivered directly to whoever happens to be standing in front of him that day. It's also worth stepping back and looking at how unusual this whole approach actually is by royal standards. For most of the 20th century, the British monarchy treated the health of its senior members as something closer to a state secret than a personal matter. King George VI's lung cancer diagnosis in the early 1950s was never publicly disclosed in his lifetime. The palace described his surgery only as necessary for structural abnormalities, language deliberately vague enough to avoid the word cancer entirely. Queen Elizabeth II, throughout her 70-year reign, gave the public remarkably little insight into her own health, right up until the carefully worded statement about her final hours. Against that backdrop, Charles's approach looks almost radical by comparison. Not just the initial decision to disclose the cancer diagnosis at all in early 2024, but the ongoing willingness to let small, human moments like a flower show quip become part of the public record. That shift didn't happen in isolation, either. It tracks with a broader move within the monarchy over the past decade toward more open discussion of health and mental health specifically. Kate Middleton's own cancer treatment and recovery, discussed with a similar mix of formal updates and more personal video messages, is part of the same pattern. Two of the most senior working royals in the country have now both gone through cancer diagnoses within roughly a year of each other, and both have chosen, to varying degrees, to let the public in on parts of that experience that previous generations of royals would almost certainly have kept entirely behind palace walls. Charles's dry jokes about aging fit into that same broader shift, not a dramatic announcement, but a small, steady erosion of the old instinct to say as little as possible. There's something worth noting about the setting, too. A flower show isn't a hospital, and it isn't a formal palace engagement built around health messaging. It's a low-stakes public event, the kind of thing where a monarch shakes hands, admires gardens, and exchanges pleasantries with well-wishers who've come out specifically to see him. That informality seems to be exactly where these comments keep surfacing, not in prepared remarks, not in official statements, but in the unscripted seconds between a stranger's kind word and Charles's own instinctive response. If anything, that makes the comments more revealing, not less. Nobody was expecting a health update at a flower show. Nobody got one, technically. What they got instead was something arguably more honest, a real answer, in real time, to a real question about what it feels like to be 77 and 2 years into cancer treatment, delivered with a dry half-smile instead of a press release. It's also worth thinking about why a comment this small traveled as far as it did once it started circulating. Royal reporters cover thousands of quotes a year from walkabouts and public engagements, the vast majority of which never make it past a single local write-up. This one did, and it's not hard to see why. It's relatable in a way most royal coverage isn't. Most people will never know what it's like to inherit a throne or manage a cancer diagnosis under constant public scrutiny, but almost everyone eventually knows what it's like to be told they are looking good for their age, and to feel the gap between that compliment and how their body actually feels day to day. Charles's answer landed because it wasn't royal at all, in the traditional sense. It was just true, in a way that translated instantly across the specific, unusual circumstances of his own life. That relatability also explains why outlets kept circling back to pair the quote with his broader medical history rather than reporting it as a standalone joke. On its own, it gets much harder, doesn't it? Is a mildly funny aside. Placed next to a cancer diagnosis, a reduced treatment schedule, and a son publicly reporting that his father is doing great, it becomes something closer to a small, honest status update, arguably a more convincing one than any formal palace statement, precisely because nobody wrote it for him in advance. None of this amounts to dramatic new information about the king's condition. The official update remains what it was in December, treatment responding well, moving into a precautionary, closely monitored phase, with his own son publicly describing him as doing great just weeks ago. But taken together, these small, scattered comments over the past 2 years paint a fuller picture than any single palace statement could. A king who spent much of his reign so far navigating a very public illness, choosing, again and again, in unscripted moments with ordinary people, to answer honestly rather than perform reassurance. There's a kind of consistency to it that's easy to overlook precisely because each individual comment is so small: a line at a hospital, a line about skiing, a line about injuries, a line in a garden. None of them, on their own, would ever make a headline. But strung together across 2 years, they add up to something closer to an ongoing, unofficial diary of what recovery has actually looked like for him, told entirely in asides rather than announcements. It gets much harder, doesn't it? Isn't a headline. It's not a health scare, and it's not really even news in the traditional sense. It's just an aging man in a garden, telling the truth to a stranger who happened to ask. On the very same day, halfway across the family, his teenage grandson turned 13, and the next generation quietly moved one step closer to everything Charles himself has spent his whole life preparing for. 2 royals, 2 very different chapters of the same institution, on the same July afternoon. One candidly admitting that things get harder with age, the other just beginning to find out what the years ahead will actually ask of him.